starving bear cub followed a man home. Months later, it returned to repay him. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the skeletal branches of the towering pines as Elias Ward moved along the snow-laden path. His breath formed soft clouds in the frigid air, while the ancient, unyielding forest stood as a silent witness to the years he had spent in solitude, each season passing like the slow, deliberate turn of a page. There had been a time when his life was filled with laughter, with the warmth of voices echoing through a home that no longer existed. But time had taken its toll, stripping away the pieces of his world until all that remained was silence and the weight of memory. He had chosen this life, or perhaps it had chosen him, and he had made his peace with it. Yet for all the solace the forest had given him, it had never offered a reason to hope again. Not until that day. The storm from the night before had left a fresh layer of snow, untouched except for the occasional trail left by rabbits or the deeper indentations where deer had wandered through. The stillness was almost sacred, broken only by the distant caw of a raven and the crunch of Elias's boots against the frost. That morning he had set out with no particular destination in mind, only the pull of habit guiding his steps along the familiar trail near his cabin. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, not for hunting, but for protection. He had long since lost the desire to take life. It was only when he noticed the disturbance in the otherwise pristine snow that he slowed his steps, his brow furrowing as he crouched to inspect the scene. There, half buried in the snow, was a small, shivering form. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but as he stepped closer, he recognized the unmistakable shape of a bear cub. Its tiny body curled in on itself, its ribs barely rising beneath its thin coat. The creature's breathing was labored, its fur matted with ice. When Elias knelt beside it, he saw its half-lidded eyes barely clinging to awareness. His breath hitched. The cub was far too young to be alone, and its mother was nowhere in sight. That meant one of two things. Either the mother had abandoned it, a rare occurrence, but not impossible, or worse, she had fallen to poachers, leaving the cub to fend for itself in a world that would show no mercy. Elias hesitated, instincts clashing with the practicality that had governed his life for so long. The cub was wild, meant for the forest, and interfering meant inviting complications he wasn't sure he wanted. But as he watched the frail rise and fall of its breath, a memory surfaced, one of another winter, when he had failed to save the life that had mattered most. His hands clenched into fists, the cold biting into his fingers. He couldn't walk away. With careful hands, he shrugged off his coat, wrapping it around the cub's fragile body. The creature stirred slightly but did not resist, too weak to fight against the warmth that now surrounded it. Elias cradled the bundle against his chest, feeling the faint pulse of life against his own heartbeat. It was light, alarmingly so, and as he stood, he was struck by the realization that had he not come this way today, the cub would not have survived another night. The thought unsettled him, an echo of something buried deep within him stirring awake. The journey back to his cabin was slow, the added weight a minor burden compared to the thoughts tumbling through his mind. He had no experience raising a bear, nor did he know if the cub would even last through the night. But he had warmth, shelter, and food, and right now that was more than what the forest could offer. As he reached the cabin, a modest structure built with his own two hands, he pushed open the door, letting the heat from the fireplace wash over them both. He set the cub down gently near the fire, unwrapping his coat with slow, deliberate movements. The bear whimpered softly, a sound so small that it barely reached Elias's ears, but it was enough to make something twist inside his chest. Shaking off the feeling, he moved quickly, retrieving an old woolen blanket and wrapping it around the cub's frail form. He rummaged through his supplies, his mind racing for a solution. Milk wouldn't do. He had none. And even if he did, cow's milk was no substitute for what the cub truly needed. Watered-down broth would have to suffice. As he set a pot to warm over the fire, he turned back to his unexpected guest, watching as it blinked slowly, its body still trembling despite the growing warmth. "You're a stubborn one," Elias muttered, mostly to himself, as he knelt beside the cub. It didn't respond, its exhaustion too great, but he wasn't expecting an answer. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Guess that makes two of us." The hours passed in quiet vigilance. Elias coaxed small sips of broth past the cub's lips, watching with a mixture of relief and concern as it swallowed weakly. He adjusted the blankets, ensuring the fire stayed lit, and sat beside the creature long into the night, listening to the rhythmic crackle of burning wood. The cabin, which had once felt too large for a man living alone, now seemed to hold something different, something fragile yet undeniably alive. When dawn broke, filtering through the frost-laced windows, Elias found himself still seated on the floor, his back against the wooden walls. The cub was curled beside him, its breathing steadier now, its body warmer than the night before. He reached out, hesitating for only a moment before letting his fingers brush against the soft fur. The cub did not stir, but something in Elias's chest did, a feeling he had not allowed himself in years. He didn't know what the days ahead would bring. He didn't know if the cub would live, or if he had just delayed the inevitable. But as he sat there watching over the small creature he had saved, Elias felt something unfamiliar settle over him, something like purpose. And for the first time in a long time, he did not feel alone. The morning light crept through the frost-covered windows of Elias Ward's cabin, casting a muted glow across the wooden floor, where the bear cub lay nestled in a bundle of blankets. The fire had dwindled to embers in the hearth, its warmth still lingering in the air. But Elias hardly noticed as he sat in his chair, his gaze locked on the small, slumbering creature. He had spent the night in a state of restless vigilance, waking at every shift in the cub's breathing, every faint whimper that broke the quiet. Now, as dawn settled fully over the forest, he found himself questioning the choice he had made. The rational part of him knew he had merely delayed what nature had intended. Wild things did not belong in the hands of men, and yet there was something in the way the cub's tiny body rose and fell in steady rhythm now, something in the way it had unconsciously curled toward the warmth of his presence that made him feel as if fate had played its hand in their meeting. With a heavy sigh, Elias rose from his chair, stretching his stiff limbs as he moved toward the fire to stoke the embers back to life. The cabin was simple, built with his own two hands in the years after everything else had fallen apart. Its walls were lined with shelves of books and supplies, a testament to his preference for solitude, and the thick wooden beams above held hooks where dried herbs and pelts hung in quiet stillness. He had made a life here, one of quiet repetition, where days bled into nights with little to distinguish one from the other. But now, as he looked back at the small life he had taken into his care, he knew that something had already shifted, whether he had wanted it to or not. He moved with practiced efficiency, heating water and setting aside what remained of the broth he had made the night before. The cub would need something more substantial soon, but Elias was not sure what that would be. He had little experience in caring for wild animals beyond the occasional injured bird or lost fawn, and a bear, especially one so young, was an entirely different challenge. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair, exhaling slowly as he considered his options. The nearest town was miles away, a half-day's journey by foot through the dense woods, and even then, he doubted anyone would have advice on how to keep a bear cub alive. The cub stirred then, a small whimper escaping its throat as it shifted beneath the blankets. Elias turned, watching as its tiny limbs stretched feebly before settling again, its dark eyes fluttering open to meet his. For a moment, neither of them moved. The cub's gaze, still clouded with sleep and weakness, held none of the fear Elias had expected. It simply looked at him, as if trying to understand what he was, as if measuring whether he was friend or foe. Elias felt a strange pang in his chest at the trust in those dark, liquid eyes. Trust that had not been earned but was given freely nonetheless. "Well," he muttered, kneeling beside the makeshift bed, "you made it through the night. That's something." The cub blinked slowly, its nose twitching as it took in the scent of its surroundings. Elias reached for the bowl of broth, testing its warmth before dipping a cloth into the liquid and bringing it to the cub's mouth. At first, it turned its head away, unaccustomed to the method, but after a moment of hesitation, it licked tentatively at the damp fabric, its small tongue flicking out to catch the taste. Encouraged, Elias continued, watching as the cub's movements grew a little stronger, a little more certain. It was not much, but it was enough to fan the small ember of hope that had begun to burn within him. The hours stretched on, filled with quiet efforts to keep the cub comfortable and fed. It remained weak, its body still too frail to move much on its own. But there was a stubbornness in the way it clung to life, a determination that Elias could not ignore. He found himself speaking to it in low murmurs, words that filled the silence in ways he had long forgotten how to. He told the cub about the forest, about the rivers that carved through the land, and the way the trees swayed in the wind like old giants whispering secrets to one another. He told it about the seasons, about the harsh winters and fleeting summers, about the way the earth renewed itself no matter how many times it was battered by storms. He did not tell it about the past. By midday, the cub had managed to sit up on unsteady legs, its body still weak but no longer on the precipice of collapse. Elias watched as it took slow, wobbly steps across the blanket before toppling onto its side with a huff of frustration. A faint chuckle rumbled from his chest, surprising even himself. "Not quite ready to take on the world yet, huh?" he mused, shaking his head. The cub made a small noise, something between a grunt and a whimper, and Elias felt an odd sense of satisfaction at the interaction. It was strange, this feeling of having another presence in the cabin, of having something else to care for beyond himself. It had been years since he had allowed himself anything close to companionship. Years since he had let anyone or anything slip past the walls he had built around himself. And yet here he was, watching over a creature that had no business trusting him, no reason to believe in his kindness. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending a shudder through the trees beyond. Elias glanced toward the door, knowing that soon he would have to make a decision. The cub could not stay here forever. Sooner or later, it would need to return to the wild, to the place it truly belonged. But looking at it now, small and helpless, he knew it would not survive on its own. Not yet. He sighed, leaning back against the wooden frame of his chair. "Guess that means you're stuck with me for a while," he muttered. The cub let out a small sound in response, its tiny body curling into the blankets once more, as if accepting the truth of those words. Elias closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. For now, at least, they would face the days ahead together. The days passed in a slow, steady rhythm, and Elias found himself falling into a new routine, one that revolved around the small life he had unexpectedly taken into his care. The bear cub, which had once been little more than a trembling heap of fur and fragile breath, was beginning to show signs of strength, though its movements were still clumsy, its legs still unsteady beneath the weight of its own body. Elias had never intended to keep it, had told himself repeatedly that he was only helping it survive until it was strong enough to fend for itself. But the act of caring for the cub had begun to weave itself into his daily life in a way he hadn't anticipated. Every morning he would rise before the sun, just as he always had. But now, instead of preparing for a solitary day of gathering firewood or tending to his traps, he would first check on the cub, ensuring it was warm, ensuring it was fed. He had fashioned a small pen of sorts in the corner of the cabin, a space lined with blankets where the cub could rest without getting into too much trouble, though already it was beginning to test its boundaries, nosing at the edges, pushing against the barriers with newfound curiosity. Elias had taken to calling it Kodiak, not because he expected it to understand the name, but because it felt wrong to continue thinking of it as simply the cub. There was something about the way it looked at him, those dark, inquisitive eyes watching his every move, that made him feel as if the creature deserved something more than anonymity. It was growing, however slowly, its fur no longer as dull, its ribs no longer as pronounced beneath its thickening coat. Its appetite had increased, and Elias had to be careful about leaving things within reach. More than once, he had turned his back only to find Kodiak gnawing on the edge of his boots or pawing at the wooden furniture as though testing what it was made of. At first, Elias had found it frustrating, but after years of living in silence, the small disruptions had begun to feel less like inconveniences and more like proof that he was not entirely alone. It was late afternoon when he decided that Kodiak needed to go outside. The cabin, though warm and safe, was not the world the cub belonged to, and Elias knew that if he kept it locked away for too long, it would only grow dependent in a way that could be dangerous when the time came to release it. Wrapping himself in his thick coat, he lifted the cub carefully in his arms, feeling the solid weight of it against his chest, and stepped out into the crisp winter air. The snow had begun to thin in places, revealing patches of earth beneath the white, and the sky above was a pale, cloudless blue, the kind that signaled the slow approach of spring. Kodiak squirmed slightly in his grip, sniffing at the new scents carried by the wind, and Elias set him down carefully, watching as the cub hesitated for only a moment before taking its first unsteady steps onto the frozen ground. At first, Kodiak seemed uncertain, his movements cautious as he pressed his nose to the snow, taking in the unfamiliar terrain. But then, as if something in his instincts had been awakened, he let out a small huff of excitement and took off in a waddling run, his paws kicking up loose powder as he stumbled forward. Ilias found himself chuckling despite himself, watching as the cub tumbled, righted itself, then tumbled again, determined to explore every inch of the small clearing. He followed at a distance, keeping a watchful eye, but for the first time since finding the cub, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the little creature would be all right. The sun dipped lower in the sky as they moved through the trees, Elias walking at a slow, measured pace, while Kodiak darted ahead, his movements growing more confident with each passing minute. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and for a brief moment, Elias let himself forget the weight that had sat heavy on his chest for so many years. It had been a long time since he had walked through these woods without feeling like a ghost haunting his own existence. Now with Kodiak at his side, there was something different in the way the forest felt. Not just a place of solitude, but something alive. Something that reminded him he too was still part of this world. It wasn't until they reached the edge of the river that Elias stopped, watching as Kodiak padded to the water's edge, sniffing at the ice-crusted surface with careful curiosity. The river was partially frozen, its currents sluggish beneath the thick sheets of ice that had formed over the winter. But Elias knew that soon as the season shifted, it would begin to thaw, carrying away the last remnants of snow and ushering in the renewal of the land. Kodiak dipped a tentative paw against the ice, recoiling slightly when the cold bit at his pads, and Elias shook his head with amusement. "Not quite ready for that yet, are you?" he murmured, stepping forward to stand beside the cub. For a long while they stood there, man and bear, watching the slow movement of the river as the sky deepened into hues of gold and violet. Elias had never been one for sentimentality, had spent too many years burying his emotions beneath layers of practicality. But as he looked down at Kodiak, at the small creature he had saved, and now watched learning the ways of the world, he felt something stir in his chest that he could not quite name. He knew deep down that this could not last forever, that one day Kodiak would have to return to the wild, to the life that had been meant for him before fate had intervened. But standing there in the fading light, Elias allowed himself, just for a moment, to believe that some things in life were worth holding on to, even if only for a little while longer. As the wind picked up, sending a flurry of snowflakes swirling through the air, Elias exhaled, rubbing a hand over his beard as he looked back toward the cabin. "Come on, Kodiak," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Time to go home." The cub hesitated, his dark eyes lingering on the river, but after a moment he turned, bounding after Elias with a newfound confidence. The walk back was quieter, the silence between them no longer feeling like loneliness, but something closer to understanding. That night, as Kodiak curled into his blankets near the fire, his small body rising and falling in steady rhythm, Ilias sat in his chair, staring into the flames, feeling the warmth seep into his bones. The world outside remained vast and uncertain, but here, in this small cabin on the edge of the wilderness, something had changed. He wasn't sure what the future held, not for himself, not for Kodiak, but for the first time in a long time, he found that he was willing to find out. The days stretched into weeks, and Kodiak grew stronger, his once frail body filling out with muscle beneath his thickening coat. His movements, once clumsy and uncertain, became surer with each passing day, his steps more confident as he ventured farther from the cabin in his playful explorations. Elias watched it all with quiet acceptance, understanding that this was how it had to be. The cub was no longer the helpless creature he had found half buried in the snow. He was growing, learning, and every instinct in his small body was beginning to call him towards something Elias could not give him. Still, he let Kodiak stay, tending to him with the same careful patience he had learned in his years of solitude. He fed him, ensured his safety, and in return, the cub filled the cabin with an energy Elias had long forgotten could exist within its walls. The once silent space now carried the sounds of Kodiak's curious snuffles, the soft thud of his paws against the wooden floor, and the occasional crash when his enthusiasm got the better of him and he sensed something tumbling from a table or shelf. Elias grumbled about it, muttered under his breath about the chaos, but he never truly minded. The forest had become their shared world, a vast and untamed expanse that Kodiak explored with increasing confidence. Elias took him to the river each day, letting him test his courage against the icy water, watching as he learned to swipe at fish with his still clumsy paws. They walked the old trails Elias had long memorized, the same paths he had once wandered alone, though now they felt different. Less like remnants of a life that had faded and more like something new. Something that belonged not only to him, but to the creature that walked beside him. Kodiak was fearless, charging through the underbrush, pressing his nose to every new scent, his dark eyes alight with discovery. Elias found himself marveling at the cub's instincts, at the way he seemed to understand things Elias had never had to teach him. There was a wildness in him, one that no amount of human care could erase, and Elias knew it was only a matter of time before that wildness would pull Kodiak away from him for good. The thought sat heavy in his chest, a weight he carried but did not voice. He told himself it was inevitable, that this was how it should be. The cub was not a pet, nor was he meant to be. He was a creature of the forest, and Elias had only been a detour in the path life had intended for him. But despite this truth, despite the understanding that had settled deep in his bones, Elias could not ignore the way Kodiak lingered near him at night, curling into his blankets by the fire, his small huffs of breath filling the quiet cabin. He could not ignore the way the cub looked back at him when they walked through the woods, as if seeking reassurance, as if tethered to him by something neither of them fully understood. It was on one of these walks that Elias knew, with certainty, that the time was coming. The forest had begun its slow thaw, the ice loosening its grip on the land, the rivers running fuller, stronger. Spring was arriving, bringing with it the first hints of green beneath the melting snow. And with it came the reminder that Kodiak did not belong here, not in this cabin, not in the world of men. They had reached the river's edge, the water dark and rushing, when Kodiak stilled beside him, his nose lifting to the air. Elias watched as something shifted in the cub's expression, something almost imperceptible, but they're all the same. Instinct, recognition, a call that Elias himself could not hear. Kodiak's ears twitched, his muscles tensing as he took a step forward, then another. He was searching for something, sensing something, though Elias did not know what. For the first time in months, a terrible quiet stretched between them. Not the comfortable silence they had shared, but something heavier, something filled with the knowledge that this moment would return again and again, until one day, Elias would not be there to watch Kodiak hesitate before stepping into the wild. He cleared his throat, looking away toward the trees, feigning indifference even as something in his chest ached. "You're feeling it, aren't you?" he muttered, more to himself than to the cub. "The pull of it." Kodiak did not answer, could not answer, but Elias saw it in his posture, in the way his paws flexed against the earth, as if readying to run. And yet after a moment, the cub turned back to him, stepping closer, his large eyes searching Elias's face before nudging his head against the man's leg. It was a gesture of trust, of comfort, and Elias let out a quiet breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Not yet, he thought, not today. The walk back to the cabin was different, filled with an understanding neither of them spoke, but both felt. Elias did not try to hold on to the moment, did not try to change what he knew was coming. He only walked beside Kodiak, matching the cub's pace, letting the quiet say all the things he could not. That night, as the fire crackled low, Elias sat with his back against the wooden wall, his fingers idly tracing the grain of the floorboards as he watched Kodiak sleep. He knew he should rest, should close his eyes and let himself drift. But he couldn't. Instead, he let himself memorize the way the cub's fur moved with each breath, the way his paws twitched in some unknown dream. Serenia, way his presence had filled the empty spaces Elias had long since resigned himself to. He knew it would not be long now. He would not make the choice for Kodiak, would not force him away before he was ready. But the forest had already begun its call, and Elias knew that one day soon, Kodiak would answer. And when that day came, Elias would do what he had always known he must. He would let him go. The fire burned low, its embers glowing in the dim cabin light, and Elias let out a slow breath, allowing himself, just for tonight, to believe that they still had time. The morning arrived in silence, the kind that stretched deep into the bones of the forest, wrapping itself around the trees and settling in the quiet space between breath and thought. Elias had risen before dawn, as he always did, though this time he found himself lingering in place before stepping out of bed, his movements slower, more deliberate. He knew what the day meant before it had even begun. The weight of it had been pressing against his chest for weeks now, creeping into the edges of his mind each time he looked at Kodiak and saw something different in the young bear's eyes. Something distant, something searching. Kodiak had grown stronger, his once wobbly steps now steady and purposeful, his body no longer frail but thick with the muscle of a creature built for survival. He was no longer the small, helpless cub Elias had found half buried in the snow. He was something else now, something wild, something ready. Elias stepped outside, the crisp morning air biting against his skin, and let his eyes sweep across the clearing, taking in the quiet details of a world that had shifted without him realizing. The river had thawed completely now, its surface dark and rippling beneath the light breeze, its voice no longer muffled beneath layers of ice. The trees, once barren and skeletal, had begun their slow return to life, buds forming on branches, the faintest hint of green peeking through the lingering frost. Spring was here, fully and undeniably, and with it came the truth Elias had tried not to face. Kodiak did not belong here anymore. The bear lumbered out of the cabin a few moments later, blinking against the morning light, his large paws pressing into the damp earth with a confidence Elias had watched grow over time. He had always known this was temporary, had told himself over and over that he was simply giving the cub time to heal, time to grow. And yet, as he watched Kodiak move toward him, that same playful glint in his eyes, a small part of Elias wished it could be different. But he had never been the kind of man to wish for things he could not have. Elias exhaled, long and slow, before turning toward the woods. "Come on, boy," he muttered, his voice rougher than he intended. "Time for one last walk." Kodiak followed without hesitation, his large paws patting against the softened ground as he fell into step beside Elias, just as he had done so many times before. They walked in silence, moving through the familiar trails that had once felt endless, but now seemed to close in around Elias with every step forward. He could still remember the first time he had brought Kodiak out here, the way the cub had stumbled through the snow, too weak to keep up, how he had scooped him into his arms and carried him the rest of the way. Now, as he glanced at the bear beside him, he knew those days were long gone. Kodiak was too big to be carried, too strong to need Elias's protection any longer. The river came into view just ahead, its waters glinting beneath the morning light, and Elias slowed his pace, letting his gaze linger on the rushing current. This had always been their place, the marker between what had been and what would come next. Kodiak padded forward, sniffing at the air, his ears twitching at the distant sounds of the forest. Something in him was already pulling away, already looking beyond this moment, and Elias knew he could not hold him back, not even if he wanted to. For a long while they stood there, side by side, neither moving, neither speaking. Elias knew what had to happen next, knew that the longer he stood here, the harder it would be to do what was right. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to take the next step, to turn toward the bear that had unknowingly become the closest thing he had to family. "It's time, Kodiak," he said, his voice steady, though it did not feel that way inside. The bear looked at him then, tilting his massive head, as if waiting for a command he did not yet understand. Elias stepped back, "Go on then," he murmured. "Go." Kodiak didn't move at first. He only watched Elias, his dark eyes locked onto him in quiet confusion. And then, slowly, he took a step toward him instead of away, closing the distance between them in one easy movement. He pressed his broad head against Elias's chest, the same way he had done when he was a cub, when he had sought comfort in the warmth of a man who had once been a stranger but had somehow become something more. Elias felt his throat tighten, his hands coming up instinctively to rest against the thick fur. "Not this time, boy," he whispered. "This time, you have to go." For a moment it seemed as if Kodiak would not listen, as if the bear would stay despite everything Elias had told himself was inevitable. But then, with a soft, rumbling exhale, Kodiak pulled back, his eyes lingering for only a moment longer before he turned toward the forest. Elias watched as he moved forward, his powerful form disappearing into the trees, his massive paws pressing into the damp earth, leaving tracks that would fade with time. And then he was gone. Elias did not move. He stood there for what felt like hours, his breath slow, measured, controlled. He had known this day would come, had known from the moment he had carried that half-frozen cub into his cabin that he would one day have to let him go. But knowing something and feeling it were two different things. The silence of the forest pressed against him, the absence of Kodiak settling over him in a way he had not been prepared for. He let out a long breath, tilting his head toward the sky, watching as the last remnants of morning mist faded into the warmth of the rising sun. After a while, he turned and made his way back toward the cabin, his footsteps slow, deliberate, not because he was uncertain, but because he knew there was no rush anymore. The fire would still be burning when he returned, the walls of his home still standing. The world had not changed, not really, only he had. That night, as he sat by the fire, the cabin felt emptier than it had in a long time. The familiar sounds of Kodiak's presence were absent, the quiet stretching too far, too wide. Elias reached for his cup, taking a slow sip, letting the heat settle deep in his chest. He would be all right. He had to be, because the forest had always known how to take back what belonged to it, and Kodiak had always belonged to the wild. The days passed in a heavy, unchanging rhythm, each one folding into the next with the same quiet solitude Elias had once embraced without question. He rose before dawn, stoked the fire, and walked the familiar paths of the forest, but the absence of Kodiak settled into every corner of his world, an ache he could not quite name. He had known it would be this way, had braced himself for the silence that would follow, but knowing did not soften the weight of it. The cabin felt different now, larger somehow, though nothing had changed within its walls. The chair near the fire remained where it had always been. The shelves still held their familiar collection of tools and books. But there was something missing in the air, a presence that had once filled the space without Elias realizing just how much he had come to rely on it. At first he told himself that Kodiak would not return. That was how it was meant to be. The bear had rejoined the wild, found his place among the rivers and trees where he belonged, and there was no reason to expect anything different. But each morning as Elias stepped onto the porch and let his gaze wander toward the tree line, he felt the quiet tug of expectation, a whisper of hope he refused to acknowledge. He listened for the rustling of branches, for the sound of heavy paws pressing into damp earth, but the forest remained as it always had, indifferent and silent. The nights were worse. Sleep came in restless fragments, his body accustomed to waking at the soft movements of the cub that had once curled near the fire. More than once he caught himself glancing toward the empty space where Kodiak used to sleep, waiting for a shadow that would not return. It was on the 7th day after the bear's departure that the storm came. The sky had been thick with the promise of it since midday, the air heavy with the scent of impending rain. But Elias had not expected its arrival to be so sudden. By late afternoon, the wind had turned sharp, howling through the trees with a force that sent branches snapping, and the first drops of rain struck the earth in rapid succession, turning the dirt to mud within minutes. He secured what little needed securing, ensuring the woodpile remained covered and the shutters were fastened tight. But something about the storm unsettled him in a way he could not quite place. He had lived through worse, had weathered countless tempests in the years he had spent alone. And yet as he stood on the porch, the rain soaking into his coat, an unease crawled beneath his skin, whispering that something was not right. He was about to turn back inside when the sound reached him. Faint at first, barely audible over the wind. But there, a cry. Not human, not the sharp call of any bird or creature of the forest, but something else entirely. Something small, something lost. His muscles tensed, instincts sharpening as he stepped off the porch, his boots sinking into the rapidly softening ground. The rain blurred the edges of the world, turning the trees into shifting shadows. But he moved forward without hesitation, following the sound as it rose again. A thin, desperate wail carried on the wind. It did not take long to find her. She was small, far too small to be out in a storm like this, her tiny form barely visible where she lay half buried in the mud near the river's edge. A child. No older than 6 or 7, her clothes soaked through, her face streaked with dirt and rain, her body trembling with the cold that had already begun to steal the color from her lips. Elias's breath caught in his throat as he moved closer, his mind racing to make sense of how she had come to be here, so deep in the wilderness, alone and afraid. She stirred at the sound of his approach, her head lifting weakly, and wide, terrified eyes locked onto his. He crouched beside her, his voice low, steady despite the storm raging around them. "Hey now," he murmured, reaching out carefully. "You're all right. I've got you." She flinched at first, her small frame tensing, but she was too weak to resist when he scooped her into his arms, her weight barely noticeable against him. She was ice cold, her body limp with exhaustion, and Elias did not waste another second before turning back toward the cabin, his strides quick, purposeful. The rain lashed against his face, the wind fighting his every step, but he kept moving, his grip firm, unyielding. By the time he reached the cabin, the storm had grown fiercer, rattling the walls as he pushed inside and kicked the door shut behind him. The fire was still burning, its warmth a stark contrast to the bitter cold that clung to the girl's small frame. He set her down gently on the blankets near the hearth, his hands moving with quiet efficiency as he grabbed another dry blanket and wrapped it around her, tucking the edges close. She let out a faint whimper, her body curling inward, and for a moment she looked so small, so fragile, that something inside Elias twisted sharply. He moved to the kitchen, his mind already sifting through what little he had that would be easy enough for her to take. Broth, the same way he had started with Kodiak. He worked quickly, setting a pot over the fire, his ears still tuned to the small sounds of her breathing, the occasional shudder that ran through her frame. When he returned, kneeling beside her once more, her eyes had opened again, unfocused but watching him with a wary sort of curiosity. He held out the cup, his voice gentler than he had used in a long time. "Drink this. It'll help." She hesitated, her small hands shaking as she reached for the cup, but she took it, sipping slowly, the warmth of it seeming to ease some of the stiffness in her limbs. Elias let her take her time, watching, waiting, until finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good Emma." He frowned. "What?" She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the cup. "My name," she murmured, her voice hoarse but certain. "Emma." Elias exhaled, leaning back slightly, nodding once. "All right, Emma," he said quietly. "You're safe now." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment he saw something in her gaze that he recognized all too well. A quiet kind of loss, an exhaustion not just from the storm, but from something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the rain or the cold. He did not ask her where she had come from. Not yet. There would be time for that later. For now, he simply let the fire warm the space between them, let the storm rage outside, knowing that once again, his world had shifted in a way he had never expected. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a world transformed, the forest glistening under a pale sun that pushed through the last lingering shreds of mist. Elias stood at the cabin door, watching the way the light caught on the trees, turning the wet branches into something almost silver, the air crisp with the scent of damp earth and pine. Behind him, the girl, Emma, still slept, curled beneath the heavy blankets near the fire, her breathing slow, steady now, the tension that had held her small frame tight through the night finally beginning to ease. He had sat up late watching over her, ensuring that the warmth seeped into her bones, that she did not wake in a panic, lost and frightened in a place she did not yet understand. She had mumbled in her sleep once or twice, soft and incoherent, the ghosts of whatever had led her here whispering through the darkness. But Elias had not asked questions. Not yet. There would be time for that later. For now, he busied himself with the quiet work of the morning, moving carefully so as not to wake her, setting a pot of water to heat, slicing what little bread he had left. He was not accustomed to having another person in his space. Suri had built his life in a way that allowed for silence, for solitude, but there was no hesitation in his movements, no resentment in the shift of his routine. He had taken her in the way he had once taken in Kodiak, without thinking, without question, as if some part of him had already made the decision before he had even known it was his to make. He glanced toward her again, watching as she stirred, blinking against the light filtering through the window, her small hands gripping the edges of the blanket before she seemed to remember where she was. Her eyes found him, wary but not afraid, and he nodded toward the cup he had set beside her. "Drink," he said simply. "It'll help." She hesitated only a moment before pushing herself upright, reaching for the cup, her fingers still trembling slightly from exhaustion. She sipped slowly, the warmth chasing the last remnants of cold from her body, and for a long moment, there was only the quiet sound of morning settling between them. When she spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been the night before, though there was something fragile beneath it, something Elias recognized. "Where am I?" "My cabin," he said, turning back to the fire, poking at the embers. "Middle of the forest, closest town's half a day's walk from here." She frowned slightly, her gaze flickering to the door, as if trying to piece together how she had ended up so far from whatever place she had come from. "I was with my dad," she said, more to herself than to him. "We were hiking. I got lost when the storm came." Elias glanced at her then, taking in the way she gripped the cup tightly, as if holding on to something solid would keep her from unraveling. He had known, of course. No child would have wandered into the heart of the forest alone, not by choice. Somewhere out there, someone was looking for her, someone who had spent the night searching through the storm, calling her name against the wind. He exhaled slowly. "Your father," he said carefully. "Where was the last place you saw him?" She swallowed, setting the cup down beside her. "We were on the ridge," she murmured, "by the old watchtower. The wind got bad and I don't know. I must have gone the wrong way." Elias nodded, standing, pulling his coat from the chair. He had known the storm had taken something from the world last night, had felt the wrongness in the air even before he had heard her cries. Now at least he could set it right. "We'll head out soon," he said. "Get you back where you belong." Emma nodded, but there was something unreadable in her expression, something uncertain. "You live here alone?" "I do." She hesitated. "Why?" He could have told her the truth, that he had chosen this life because it was easier than facing what he had lost, that the weight of the past was quieter in the company of trees and rivers than in the presence of people who asked too many questions. But instead, he only said, "Because it's where I'm supposed to be." She seemed to accept that, and after she had eaten, after Elias had ensured she was strong enough to make the journey, they stepped out into the morning, the damp earth soft beneath their feet. The storm had left the forest altered, branches torn from trees, the river swollen with rain, but the path was still there, waiting for them. They walked in silence for a while, Emma trailing just behind him, her small steps careful but determined, and Elias found himself listening for something he had long since stopped expecting to hear. It was just as they reached the base of the ridge that the sound came, distant at first, almost lost beneath the rustling of leaves. A deep, low rumble, a presence in the air that Elias felt before he saw. Emma stopped beside him, her fingers curling into the fabric of his sleeve. "What is that?" Elias did not answer, not immediately. Instead, he turned, his gaze scanning the trees, searching the spaces between shadows. And then, there he was. Kodiak. The bear stood at the edge of the clearing, larger than before, his thick coat gleaming beneath the morning light. His dark eyes locked onto Elias with a recognition that sent something sharp and unexpected through his chest. He had not expected this, had not dared to hope for it. And yet here Kodiak was, standing before him, not a ghost, not a memory, but real. Elias exhaled, slow and steady, and for the first time in weeks, he let himself smile, just a little. Emma was staring, wide-eyed. "That's Kodiak," Elias said simply. The bear took a step closer, his massive paws pressing into the damp ground. But there was no hesitation in his movements, no uncertainty in the way he closed the distance between them. He let out another low huff, his breath clouding in the cool air, and Elias reached out, pressing his hand lightly against the thick fur of Kodiak's shoulder, feeling the warmth beneath his palm, the steady strength of the creature he had once nursed back from the brink of death. "You came back," Elias murmured, more to himself than to the bear. Kodiak only let out a soft, rumbling sound, his head tilting slightly, as if he had never truly left. Elias exhaled, glancing at Emma, who was still watching with something between awe and disbelief. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the ridge. "Let's get you home." And as they walked, Kodiak moving alongside them, his presence as steady as the forest around them, Elias realized something he had not allowed himself to believe for a long time. That home was not just a place, it was the people, the creatures, the moments that tethered you to the world. And for the first time in years, he did not feel alone.